In reconvening our conversation on transgenderism, I think it is important first to note, Cameron, that your argument had several strengths, and I particularly appreciated how you pointed out that the church has both failed to be welcoming to transgender peoples, but has also sort of fed the fire in its pigeonholing people into particular gender roles. And I thought that is a very important conversation that we need to have further. I think you were onto something there, so thank you for pointing that out. But I'd like to begin this conversation with sort of discussing how you continue to refer to transgenderism as a behavior, but I would argue, in fact, that's actually incorrect, because transgenderism is related to an intrinsic gender identity. And so you can't simply say this is a type of behavior that a person has because it's so internalized. It's not particularly a lifestyle choice that someone makes, but it is an innate thing. So I think your terminology is a little bit off there, which really has a lot of implications for the rest of your argument. Genesis 1:27, in reference to God-given gender identity in his creative act, I think it is also pushing it a little bit, because biological sex is determined at creation. I would not argue with you for that point, but like I was saying before, gender identity is more of an innate thing, and it is a physiological trait that we develop as we move forward from birth into adulthood. And so we cannot assert that gender identity is assigned at our birth or at our creation or what have you, simply because our biological sex has been determined by God's creative act. So since gender identity has to do with a conscious and subconscious identification with one particular gender, then this gender identity is not necessarily attested to according to a person's biological sex. That is determined at birth. So I think we should be careful of our hermeneutic there in asserting that gender identity is predetermined and can be attested to at birth. I just simply think that that's not. And with regard to your discussion on Romans 1 and sexuality, you rightly pointed out that the passage is sort of indicative of humanity's downfall or failure or what have you, sort of straying from God's design for sexuality. And I think that that's true, and it does attest to that within the context of the issue of homosexuality. And I do think that that is a sin. But I do not think, however, that a transgender person is necessarily associated with the sin of homosexuality, because transgenderism is not simply a behavioral choice, but is an innate sort of inherent identification with one particular gender over another. And so a person might be a transgender male who is sexually attracted to women, and while that person's biological sex determined at birth might be female, perhaps this person goes through a sexual change surgery, or perhaps this person does not, but because the subconscious and conscious gender identification is that of a male, I think it can be said that this is a male who is attracted to a female. And, further, this text does not address transgenderism specifically, and it does not assert that that is the sin at hand, but that homosexuality is. And I think those things are inherently different, and we must certainly make that distinction as part of this conversation and how we read this text.